Thank you very much, Rick, for that musical introduction. Well, what a few weeks it's been in all aspects. I should actually be with my wife in Sydney, but thank you, COVID, I can't go back to Sydney at the moment, so I'm here. And what a few weeks it's been in space. We've seen Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson opening up the field of privateers in manned space flight, going to suborbital flight, very much as the Americans did in the early 1960s. And now we have the possibility of moving ahead, the possibility of space tourism. It's quite magical. But with this success, one can never take it for granted, because for all the success, there have been failures and near misses. And those near misses, a lot of them are not recorded. They go way back to the end of the Second World War. Can we have the next slide, please? Following the Second World War, a lot of the captured German V-2 rockets were brought to the United States and were tested out at the White Sands Space Facility in New Mexico. On May 30th, 1947, one such test was taking place. It was a night launch. It went about 7 o'clock at night, and it was designed to go up into the upper atmosphere, test some instruments and land back down. That didn't quite go to plan. The rocket went up. Next slide, please. The rocket went up. It was called a Hermes 2 rocket. It went up, but on its way back down, its guidance system failed. And with the guidance system failing, what happened, instead of coming back down and landing in the White Sands Proving Ground, the rocket went down, and then it changed direction. It actually headed towards El Paso, Texas, and its sister town of Juarez, Mexico. I've been to El Paso, I've been to Juarez, yeah, so this probably improved it. But the rocket came down and headed for Juarez and impacted right near the Juarez airport. People in Juarez started flooding the emergency services with calls. They thought they were being bombed. No, it was only the V-2 rocket, way off course, landing near the Juarez airport. It was so great of an impact that it actually buckled the runway at Juarez airport, and the planes kept landing. So in the days afterwards, you had this enormous impact crater near the airport, and all these people scurrying around trying to find little bits and pieces of V-2 rocket to salvage as souvenirs. Next slide, please. By the late 1950s, the Soviets and the Americans are starting to get their act together in space. The Soviets launched Sputnik on October the 4th, 1957, and the American answer was going to be the Vanguard satellite. The Vanguard was a three-stage rocket. It was a three-stage rocket put together by the Navy, and it wasn't really the most super effective rocket. It took about 4 goes before we finally got this thing right. Next slide, please. On its first test flight, the American networks went live. All the American networks carried the Vanguard rocket live. At 11:44 local time, the countdown reached 0 and the rocket began to rise. It rose for approximately 2 seconds. It reached a height of 1.2 metres before it slowly came down and sagged back into pad 18A and exploded. The little satellite perched on top, well, it was fine. It separated. It thought it was actually in space. It separated and it rolled away into the field surrounding pad 18A, or what was left of pad 18A, and it began beeping away merrily as if it was reporting from space. The Americans were left red-faced. The Soviets did not miss this opportunity. This was the height of the Cold War. So for many people around, it felt like the gates of hell had broken open when this explosion consumed the launch pad. The Russians, however, through their UN representatives, were quick to capitalise, offering US delegates aid under the USSR's program of technical assistance for backward nations. The American media was no less sympathetic. They savaged the Vanguard program with headlines such as Flopnik and Kaputnik in the press the next day. There were many theories as to what had happened. The Glenelg Martin Company, manufacturer of the Vanguard booster, concluded that low pressure during booster ignition allowed burning fuel in the combustion chamber to leak into the fuel system via the injector head before full pressure was attained. Basically, the thing just collapsed. Next slide, please. The Russians were not immune to such failures either. In 1960, both Russia and America were developing larger boosters than had been previously seen. The Russians had developed the R-16 missile. It was the first intercontinental ballistic missile to be developed in the Soviet Union. Developed by Chief Designer Mikhail Yangel, the R-16 stood 30 metres tall with an operational range of 11,000 to 13,000 kilometres, dependent on the size of the warhead carried. By October of 1960, the R-16 was ready for launch at Site 41 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Soviet Premier Khrushchev was currently in the United States, and he was looking for a propaganda success to capitalise during his visit. A launch attempt on October 23rd had been scrapped due to issues with propellant loading. Next slide, please. By directive of the State Commission, repairs were undertaken and were overseen by one of their chief military officers. The launch on the 24th went down to 30 minutes, and then it went into a hold. What caused that hold is disputed. It was either an electrical issue or a leak of nitric acid. The official, Marshal Nadellin, wanted the missile repaired and prepared for flight. So he asked that a chair, was actually a two-seater lounge, be bought and placed at the base of the launch pad so he could supervise the repairs. In the flight control room, an alert engineer noticed that not all the switches were where they should be. One relating to the launch sequencer was set in the wrong position, and as a result, the batteries in the second stage of the R-16 rocket were actually on when they should have been off. What that meant was that the vehicle, while they're working on this vehicle with oxyacetylene gear no less, is actually fully powered. The engineer in the launch control centre moved the control back to being powered off, but in doing so, it actually sent a signal to the second stage of the rocket. That rocket fired, the rocket engines lit up and caused the catastrophe you see on the screen here. Mikhail Yangel, one of the designers, was outside the perimeter having a smoke, and he saw the whole thing. The rocket instantly ignited and fell back into the first stage, causing it to explode. The whole of the launch pad was consumed in an incredible fireball, and at that time, there were 250 people estimated to be in and around the launch pad. All of those 250 people were killed, either by the exploding rocket or by the tarmac around the base of the launch pad basically becoming liquid tar. They got caught in the liquid tar and could not escape the fireball. Mitfei Nadellin, they never found a sign of him, and yet ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall. For many years it was said that Nadellin had died in an airplane crash, and it wasn't until the fall of communism that the actual story became known. Next slide, please. The first man into space was Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin flew April 12, 1961. However, before that, there was a chamber test that was run with a serving Russian cosmonaut. The chamber test was to run 15 days altogether. The chamber test involved the cosmonaut, Valentin Bondarenko, participating in an isolation test in the chamber in a pure oxygen environment. On day 10, Bondarenko had completed a medical test. He was taking medical sensors off his chest and using cotton swabs to get the alcohol off his skin. At the same time, he's boiling a cup of tea on a hot plate nearby. Without thinking, Bondarenko takes the cotton swab, next slide please, and just discards it to his right. It lands on the hot plate. He's in a pure oxygen environment. What happened next was one of the most horrific things in the Soviet manned space program. That altitude chamber became a fireball. Bondarenko was trapped. Efforts to get him out from the outside took minutes. By that time, Bondarenko had been burnt in over 90% of his body. Bondarenko, on coming out of the altitude chamber, said repeatedly, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." He was taken to hospital. Yuri Gagarin accompanied him to the hospital. He died some 8 hours after being brought out of the chamber. 2 weeks later, Yuri Gagarin would sit atop an R-7 rocket and become the first man to make an orbit of the Earth. Next slide, please. Throughout the early 1960s, the Russians and the Americans continued their progress towards the stated goal, stated by President Kennedy, of a manned lunar landing. Speculation remains today, was there actually a race between the Soviets and the Americans? Some say yes, some say no. But in order to upstage the Americans in early 1965, then Russian Premier Khrushchev ordered a space spectacular. Once again, he was visiting the United States. So Soviet space designers came up with a new rocket. That rocket, that spacecraft, was known as Voskhod. What is Voskhod? Voskhod is a stripped-down version of the Vostok spacecraft that launched Yuri Gagarin in 1961. But it has a couple of very different features. Next slide, please. It has room for 3 cosmonauts. On the first flight, 3 cosmonauts crammed inside, can't move. No safety equipment, going up in the equivalent of tracksuits. On the second flight, Khrushchev wanted more. He wanted a spacewalk because it was known that the Americans would launch Gemini 3 in March of 1965, and there was a potential for a spacewalk on that flight. He wanted to upstage that flight. And this is what was created, Voskhod 2. You can see that it divides into a re-entry module and an orbital module. The orbital module has 2 seats in it, and it has a flexible airlock which extends out from the side of the spacecraft. Alexei Leonov, one of the Russian cosmonauts, gets inside this airlock. He's suited up in a spacesuit, and he heads outside. The whole walk is filmed by the camera you can see off to the right of the airlock. He's outside, he's floating for around about 10.5 minutes. During that time, his suit inflates. He has a control down here, near his knee, which he can use to take photographs. He can't reach it because the suit has begun to balloon. As he goes to re-enter the spacecraft, he has a problem. The suit has ballooned to such a point that he cannot get back in to the top part of the docking probe. He's literally stuck. So he does what nobody should ever do in a space mission, particularly on a spacewalk, and that is he lets the air out of his suit. He depressurises his suit. He has another go. He's trying to squeeze in feet first, can't get in. Turns around, gets hold of the docking module, lets a little bit more air out. Finally, he's able to squeeze in, but he's the wrong way round. He can't turn around. He's got to use all his effort to make a 180-degree turn to finally squeeze back in to the crew module of the Voskhod 2 spacecraft. He's worn out. He's dripping with sweat. He is totally delirious. He almost doesn't know where he is. Finally, they get Leonov in. They strap him in. They separate the airlock. Next day, here we go. We're going to go and re-enter. We're going to bring these guys home. Problems with the spacecraft's engines means that they land off course. They land in a forest. They get caught in a pine tree, in a pine forest. They actually have to spend the night in a snow blizzard, crouching in the spacecraft And to make matters worse, there's wild wolves that are circling the spacecraft. It takes a day and a half for rescue crews to come in through the pine forest and actually rescue the 2 cosmonauts. Next slide, please. America was also not immune to such problems. Gemini 8 in March of 1966 was the first of a series of 3-day flights, and it was commanded by an almost unknown civilian astronaut, probably never heard of him, a fellow by the name of Neil Armstrong. Next slide, please. 8 was launched on March 16, 1966 with 2 objectives. Number 1, they were going to join 2 vehicles in orbit, the Gemini spacecraft and an Agena target vehicle. You could see the Agena target vehicle on the right. They were also going to do a spacewalk. Dave Scott, who went on to command Apollo 15, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of 15 just in the last few days, would do that spacewalk. But on the first day, on the very first hours of this flight, what happens? The astronauts on their 4th orbit come in to rendezvous with the Agena, and before they do, they get a call from the ground from another guy you've never heard of, Jim Lovell, who would go on to command Apollo 13. Jim Lovell says, if you run into trouble with the Agena, just punch in the command 400 on your encoder and take control of the spacecraft. You'll be all right. The astronauts took note of it, but thought nothing of it. What happened next was almost indeterminate. As the astronauts docked with the spacecraft, the next thing that they feel is a slight pitch motion up and down, a slight yaw motion left to right. Almost indiscernible. They think it's a problem with the spacecraft, so they start testing thrusters. But the problem continues. In the end, Armstrong elects to undock from the Agena. He thinks the problem's with the Agena, so he undocks. What happens then? The rate of spin and tumble only gets worse. So he isolates the spacecraft thrusters and takes control with the re-entry thrusters. Now, the problem with that, re-entry thrusters, once they're fired up, mission rules say you're coming home on the next available orbit. The Gemini 8 mission's basically over. But there was a necessary manoeuvre because the spacecraft was spinning so wildly and so violently, both astronauts were having tunnel vision and were at risk of blackout. Had they blacked out, they would have lost control of the spacecraft totally. As it was, they were able to regain control of the spacecraft. Their mission was essentially over, and they landed in a backup landing zone off the coast of Okinawa, Japan. They land, and all they can hear is Japanese music coming over their radio. It takes a couple of hours for the Leonard F. Mason, the recovery carrier, to come in and pick them up. And during that time, they're sitting there on the seas going up and down and up and down. And at insult to injury, both Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott threw up. And then they had to go through the ignominious process of climbing a rope ladder to get onto the recovery ship. Can you advance through a couple of slides? I'll tell you when. I'm going to have to miss a few things. I'm running long. Just keep going. Keep going. About 3 more. Okay, this slide. I want to flash forward before I finish to something that many people may or may not remember. Everybody remembers the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. 21 months later, we come back. We return to flight with the Space Shuttle Discovery on STS-26. It was a mission that the whole world knew about, but weeks later, another space shuttle flew. It was Atlantis on mission STS-27. Next slide, please. 27 was a military mission, so there was no public commentary for launch or landing, and all communications between the crew and the ground were encrypted. What a lot of people didn't realise was that 83 seconds after launch, a bunch of ice actually impacted the starboard side of Atlantis on the black tiles. Is this sounding familiar to a few people? If you think forward a few years to 2003 and the Space Shuttle Columbia, the astronauts got word while they were on orbit that there was a potential problem, that tiles may have been compromised. The astronauts used their remote manipulator, I'll get it on the third try, remote manipulator arm, there we go, and dangled it over the side of Atlantis. It has a television camera at its very head, and they were able to see the damage that had been caused by the ice. But because they were on a military mission, all communication and video was encrypted, so the video that was sent to the ground was very poor quality. The ground comes back, says no problem. But the astronauts looking out of window 1, on the wraparound windows there, they can see damage. They are so concerned, they are convinced that they are not getting home. This is 2 flights after the Challenger accident. Next slide, please. They are so concerned that astronaut Mike Mullane, who was meant to be seated on the mid-deck for landing, instead stands up on the flight deck behind the flight crew during the whole of the re-entry, monitoring the instruments with the crew. His feeling was, if this is going to come unglued, I don't want to be downstairs. I want to be up with my crew members. The whole way down, the astronauts don't know whether they're going to survive. At this point in the shuttle program, we still had the communications blackout. We hadn't set up our worldwide communications network of satellites yet. So the crew had no idea of what was happening. Neither did Mission Control. Mission Control should have, quite rightly, been crippled with fear at the thought of what was going to happen. Atlantis made it through re-entry. It landed, as you can see, on the runway out at Edwards Air Force Base on 1-5 out there. But the tail damage extends from the nose of the orbiter all the way back to where the grey section begins. That's called reinforced carbon-carbon, that grey section. And then look at the landing wheel door. On the left-hand side, you can see an area of white, more tail damage. Next slide, please. Once they land and they get out, the crew go and inspect, and you can see the severity of the impact that the ice has had on those tiles. Now, if those tiles unzip, in other words, one goes and then they all start popping off during re-entry, you will lose the vehicle. There is no way for this vehicle to come back. Next slide, please. This image shows the extent of the damage. You could see that a whole tile and 2 other tiles are actually missing, and there is severe burn damage to the cloth that's beneath the tiles. If another tile had gone, we would not have had the Columbia accident, because we would have had the Atlantis accident. End of program. You lose 2 vehicles in 3 flights. End of program. Next slide, please. This schematic really demonstrates how close Atlantis came to a Columbia-style accident. If you look to the right, you see the approximate tile damage of Atlantis. I might have to move a little bit so people can see it. You look on the reinforced carbon-carbon, you see exactly where the debris hit on Columbia. NASA knew about the tile issues at the time of the Challenger accident. Had been noticed as early as Flight 7 in 1983. So the question has to be asked, why was nothing done during the 21-month period of downtime during the Challenger accident? We fixed the solid rocket boosters which caused the Challenger accident, but we did not fix the shedding problems that was affecting the tiles on virtually every flight from Flight 7 all the way through the program. Had that been addressed, we would not have had a Columbia accident. I'm near the end of my time, so thank you all very much. Pleasure to be here this evening.